Welcome everyone to the first session in our webinar series entitled Taking Shape, New Perspectives on Arab Abstraction, which is co-organized by New York University's Gray Art Gallery and Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies and co-sponsored by Arte East. My name is Lucy Oakley and I'm Head of Education Programs at the Gray. Today's session focuses on the Barjeel Art Foundation and on curating the exhibition Taking Shape, Abstraction in the Arab World, 1950s to 1980s, which was on view when the Gray shut down to help contain the spread of coronavirus. Since that time, the Gray's NYU student interns and staff have been working hard remotely to bring you a rich array of online features. I encourage you to visit the Gray's website and check these out. Today's session is the first in a series of 3 designed to recreate the afternoon symposium we were planning to present on March 13th, literally the day NYU announced it was shutting down. Session 2, our next session, will focus on Arab abstraction and Arabic letter forms, and session 3 on modern art from Algeria and Egypt. You'll find more information on all 3 sessions on the Gray's website. Session 2 will take place a week from today at 6 p.m. Please note that to receive the unique Zoom link for each session, you'll need to RSVP on the Gray's website. At this point, I'd like to thank the people whose support and encouragement has been essential to organizing this program. I'll be forever grateful to Jim Ryan, Associate Director of NYU's Kevorkian Center, for his friendship and steadfast collaboration on the Gray's many programs addressing topics in Middle Eastern art, including this webinar series. Beth Stryker of Arte East has been tremendously helpful, not only in co-organizing past public programs with the Gray, but also in helping to publicize this webinar series. Last but not least, I must express heartfelt thanks to my Gray colleague, Eric Orasek, who is our tech wizard behind the scenes, lending his skills to co-organize this event on many levels. I could not have managed this webinar without him. I'm also immensely grateful to today's speakers, Sultan Al-Qassemi and Suheyla Takesh, for their participation. Thanks to the power of Zoom, they are joining us from Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates, where the time zone is 8 hours later than in New York City, where we're located. And that's why we're starting this session at noon. Before we begin, a word about today's program. Over 300 people have signed up to attend. It will last for about an hour or so. At the end, Lynn will pose audience questions to the speakers. You can submit a question anytime during the program by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We've turned off the chat feature for this program, but do feel free to send comments as well as questions through the Q&A. The program is being recorded and will be posted on the Gray's website with closed captions at a future date. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Lynn Gumpert, who is co-curator with Suheyla Takesh of Taking Shape. Lynn has been director of the Gray Art Gallery since 1997, and during her tenure, she has overseen more than 70 exhibitions. Before coming to the Gray, she was an independent writer and curator, and she organized shows in New York, Japan, and France. Between 1980 and 1988, she was curator and senior curator at the New Museum in New York. Take it away, Lynn.
Thank you. Very pleased to take part in today's session, and thank Eric and Lucy as well. I am also very pleased to introduce friends and colleagues. Together we co-organized this exhibition. As Lucy mentioned, Sultan Sooud Al-Qassemi is the founder of the Barjeel Art Foundation, an independent initiative established in 2010 to contribute to the intellectual development of the art scene in the Arab region by building a prominent and publicly accessible art collection in the United Arab Emirates. He is currently researching a book on modern architecture in Sharjah in the UAE and his lectures on the politics of modern Middle Eastern art at a number of American universities, including NYU, George Washington, and Boston College. Suheyla Takesh is a curator at the Barjeel Art Foundation. She received her master's in history, theory, and criticism of architecture and art at MIT, and she has previously curated exhibitions at the Sharjah Art Museum, the Contemporary Art Platform in Kuwait, and the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, among others. So I'm very pleased to have them present their papers, and afterwards we'll be open for questions.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I appreciate it. I also want to echo the thanks that Lucy mentioned to everybody who's put this event together. I wish I was with you in New York, but I am heartened by the great response we've had to this event. And I will go through the idea of establishment of Barjeel over the past 10 years. We're celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. And so I will take you through the idea of Barjeel and the road to the grey art, if I may say. I will share my screen with you if possible. Yes, it is possible. And sorry, there you go. Okay, can you guys see this? Okay, so so the idea of establishment of Barjeel, Lucy, really comes from a long tradition in the Middle East of collectors who have opened up their art collection. I think of Mahmoud Khalil and his wife, Emilienne Khalil, who was French. Mahmoud Khalil was an Egyptian collector, and he opened his home many decades ago. He started collecting around the turn of the century, and his house now is one of the most important collections of art in the region. He actually acquired Western masterpieces, including Van Gogh, Monet, and a number of other works from the West. He didn't buy many Middle Eastern works, but the idea of sharing the collection really is something that is embedded, I think, in Middle Eastern tradition, opening up your home. His wife outlived him, but then continued this tradition even after he died, donating the house to the state. Maybe closer to the region inspiration for me is Sheikha Hassa Al-Sabah, who is from Kuwait, and she founded in the 1970s the Sheikha Hassa and Sheikh Nasser Al-Sabah Islamic art collection. And it is considered to be one of the most respected and important collections of Islamic art in the world. And in fact, the collection is housed in a converted modern structure, an American hospital that was built almost a century ago, about 1920. And now that structure houses the Islamic collection of Sheikha Hassa. Now, another element of Sheikha Hassa's collection really inspired me, which is the fact that she took the collection on tour throughout the past 3 decades. The collection has been touring a number of very prestigious museums, from the Hermitage, even the Mahmoud Khalil Museum, all the way to museums in the US. And this is part of Kuwaiti, or let's say Sheikha Hassa's own cultural diplomacy. And that was very important for me when I was thinking about the establishment of Barjeel and linking it to a type of cultural diplomacy. And I mean, it's quite an impressive roster of institutions that they have shown, and they continue to show. So this is definitely not exhaustive. They've continued to show their collection even until the last few months. Another inspiration for me is Sheikh Hassan Al Thani in Qatar. Sheikh Hassan is a renowned and respected collector of Arab art, and maybe this is the closest to me because Barjeel collection is a collection of mostly modern contemporary Arab art. Sheikh Hassan started collecting in the 1980s, and I've had the pleasure and honor of meeting him a number of times in his house, and the house that he had created to house the collection before it moved into Mathaf. And Mathaf is shown at the bottom right. Mathaf is the Arab Museum of Modern Art in Doha, Qatar. And his collection really forms the genesis or the crux of the Mathaf collection. I think several thousand works from Mathaf's collection comes from Sheikh Hassan Al-Thani. He also befriended artists. He really invested in giving Arab art a home where this wasn't a common, at least not in the 1980s, or not as common. Barjeel beginnings, I had written endless letters to the government, emails asking them for a space when the collection was all too small. I think we had 70 or 80 artworks, and I asked the government for a space, and they donated, or they gave me the space rent-free in 2009, and we inaugurated an exhibition in 2010 in February, and this is the inaugural exhibition. We showed a number of contemporary artworks in that exhibition. We were also hosting a number of talks. It was quite popular then to have the space in Sharjah. We collaborated with a number of our partners, but I should say we started loaning works in 2011, 2012. We were approached by major exhibitions, including one at the Mori Art Museum in 2012 that called Arab Express, and we loaned them a number of works. This continued into 2013, 14, with a number of other museums, including the Museum of Contemporary Art in Antwerp, where we loaned them modern works. And this was important because this is the first time that we actually try and contribute and not just loan, but try to have an active role in the loan, explaining the significance of certain artworks to the museum, and not just making the works available, but trying in a way to explain to them why this work might be more appropriate than the other. Our first sort of almost in-house international exhibition, in-house organized international exhibition, was this one at the Singapore Art Museum, curated by the founding curator of Barjeel, Mandi Mirzaban. And this exhibition took place in 2013. And what we did here was we took 16 works, about 9 or 10 were from Barjeel, and 6 were from regional collections, including the UAE and Qatar and elsewhere. We took these works to Singapore for 3 months. It was a very, very popular exhibition. We had some modern works, we had video works, and this was really the exhibition that launched Barjeel, I think, on the international scale. We were approached in 2013, the same year of that show, by Omar Kholeif, who is now with the Sharjah Art Foundation, but was then with the Whitechapel Gallery in London, to organize an exhibition called Imperfect Chronology that would last for almost a year and a half, and would be almost an exhibition that would be not a survey, but quite a comprehensive exhibition of over 100 works for 100 years from the Arab world. It was a very popular exhibition, and this was maybe sort of our tipping point of Barjeel on the international stage. It lasted for a year and a half. It was much like Taking Shape. It was in a world capital in London, and it drew a lot of colleagues, a lot of visitors, and a lot of press attention as well. Amongst our first collaborations with academic institutions, which is what our collaboration with Taking Shape was this collaboration with Yale University Art Gallery in early 2017. This is an exhibition that was very important for Barjeel because it was an exhibition that was seen as a show that can be taught through, that students can write about. It was a collaboration with a university, again, much like the collaboration with the Gray. I even took my students from the Kevorkian Center to visit this show in 2017 when I was there. And this was also another important milestone. If you recall, I had spoken about Sheikha Hissa of Kuwait and her cultural diplomacy, and definitely she was in the back of my mind. Sheikha Hissa is always there. I'm very much inspired by her. And what she did with cultural diplomacy with Kuwait, taking the collection almost as a cultural emissary of the state of Kuwait. I tried to do this with the collection of Barjeel. And we took this exhibition called The Sea Suspended in 2016 to Tehran in Iran at the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art. And this exhibition was quite challenging to mount, especially because just a few months before we were working on this exhibition, a regional war broke out, and there were proxy forces that were allied with one side or the other, without naming names. And these proxy forces were almost in a way jeopardizing this idea of this exhibition. But fortunately, I'm really glad to say that we pushed through. The exhibition did take place. We had the Deputy Minister of Culture of Iran show up. It was a huge success. Many Iranians who had not seen a lot of these modernist Arab masters were able to see these works for the first time, because remember, Iranians, for one reason or the other, were not able to travel to Iraq or maybe to Syria or to Saudi or or Egypt or any regional country. And here we were able to take 40 artworks to them. And it was a huge hit, especially with Iranian students and Iranian academics. Barjeel also publishes a lot. I won't go into this, but publishing in 5 or 6 languages is a very important part of Barjeel's idea. But I want to show you this slide, which again is inspired by Sheikha Hassa in Kuwait. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the first 8 years of Barjeel. We've mounted 28 exhibitions. And if you count this past year, it would be 30 exhibitions. So 30 exhibitions in 10 years, the average of 3 exhibitions a year. We really worked very, very hard. The curators, Mandi Merzaban, Kareem Sultan, Suheyla Takesh, and our other colleagues worked so hard to mount these 30 exhibitions. And again, this is a self-funded and not a state-funded endeavor. So you could imagine what kind of strain it has put on us all, sort of mentally, but also on my own finances. It was really an endeavor. We almost here acted like some states, in the sense that we really took cultural diplomacy to another level. And this is available for everybody to see. But the reason that Taking Shape took place, the exhibition that is now at the Gray, is that I was a practitioner in residence. I was invited by the Kevorkian Center of Near Eastern Studies at NYU. And when I was there, I had the pleasure of interacting a number of times with Lynn Gumpert, who is our moderator tonight and the director of the Gray Art, and one of the most respected curators and directors anywhere in the world. And so I visited Lynn, and the idea of the exhibition came about. And Lynn had suggested that there was never an exhibition of abstract art from the Arab world, which is quite true if you think about it. A couple of other elements I want to go through quickly. This is a beautiful painting by an Egyptian artist called Minhat Hilmi, titled Space Exploration, from the early 1970s. But I want to share with you how we got this work. So I want to do a shout out to social media. Apparently there is someone around the world trying to regulate social media, but I want to maybe give us a shout out to how great social media companies are, at least for us. I remember posting a number of tweets saying, I am looking for modernist women artists. I am missing modernist women artists. Is it the case that there weren't any, or is it the case that I am ignorant of them? And I was very happy to learn that it was the latter, that I was ignorant about modernist women artists. And fortunately, there was this lovely Sudanese lady called, I think, Hala Osman. That is not her real name down there. And she had messaged me and said, when I was in Egypt, there was my neighbor who was an important artist. Here's the contact of the family. And so I contacted the family, and they were very kind and they were very welcoming, and we acquired the work. And there's a picture down there at the bottom right of the screen showcasing the work, which is now at the Gray Art Gallery. So the use of social media cannot be sort of overestimated, and how we were able to use social media in order to enrich not only the exhibition at the Gray Art, but also the collection as a whole, investing in these artists, making sure that they are seen sometimes decades after them not being seen or not being put on display. Another thing I want to say is very important. I mentioned this is a personal collection or a private collection, what I like to call a private foundation for the public good, but in the end, it's a personal collection. A lot of it depends on the whims of the individual, the collector, which in this case is me. And I could definitely err. I could make many mistakes. I could I could be constrained by financial constraints. I could be constrained by even knowledge of not knowing about abstractions from other countries. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of missing abstractions. When you go to see the exhibition at the Gray, what are you missing? And in reality, you are missing important abstract modernists from the Arab world, including a Saudi modernist, Muhammad al-Salim. Muhammad al-Salim was able to bring together the letter, but also the desert. He was able to turn these letters into landscapes. And it's an important missing artist from the collection. But I like to acknowledge this, and there's so many others. So another group of artists that we are missing is, for example, the Syrian abstract movement. So there was a movement of Syrian abstraction that started in 1963, lasted until 68, I believe, or so, and including Nasir Shawra, Mahmoud Dadoush, Mahmoud Hamad, and maybe a couple of other artists. These were artists that are missing from the collection. However, we've acquired a couple of these works since. So had we mounted this exhibition now, it would have included these works perhaps. And finally, the last slide I will show you, or the last artist I'll talk about, is Suha Shoman. Suha Shoman is an artist who had not sold for 35 years. It was very, very challenging to acquire one of her works. And we were only able to do so in November 2019. And by then we had reached the sort of the end date of adding or modifying the works going to the Gray. And so this work now is at the Sharjah Art Museum, but this work certainly would have made it to the Gray Art Gallery because of how important this artist is. She was trained by Fakhr al-Nisa Zaid. She started the Darat al-Funun Foundation in Amman. She brought a number of artists to teach and lecture in Jordan. So a hugely, hugely important artist. And this is, I think, largely one of the most important examples of missing abstractions. However, this is an evolving collection, and I think I'll stop there. So thank you very much. I will now hand over to my colleague, Suheyla, who I believe will be sharing her screen.
Thank you, Sultan, and thank you, Lynn, also for the introduction earlier, and everybody at NYU and RT East for organizing this. Hi, everyone in the audience. I will just share my screen real quick. All right. So what I'll be talking about today is not so much on the specific artworks that are on display in the exhibition, but take you, backstage a little bit and speak more on Lynn and I's process of putting this exhibition together, and the kind of questions we were asking, the challenges that we faced, many of which were methodological, and sort of an expectations versus reality experience that we had with this exhibition. So the idea to focus on abstraction, as Sultan has mentioned, was actually Lynn's idea, and it's a conversation she had with Sultan back in 2017. And then the following year, we spent some time together in Sharjah going through the physical collection, and this is when we made sort of the first rough selection of works. Of course, the selection kind of kept expanding and contracting as we worked through the project, but I think this can already give you an indication of how in the beginning of the process, we almost worked our way backwards, where we took the objects as our starting point, as sort of a launch pad, and then allowed them to kind of guide and lead the direction of our research. Now, in retrospect, looking at this moment of how we approach this initial selection, this preliminary selection, I think is actually very telling of the inherent problems, or let's say challenges, in working with and studying modernism in different contexts, and particularly in non-Western contexts. So what I mean by this is that, when we were at the Barjeel storage facilities in our warehouse here in Sharjah, sort of sifting through the collection, we singled out the works that to us sort of looked abstract, or fit the fit our expectation of what an abstract work is or what it should look like. And of course, that was also based on a certain conditioning and the kind of training we received, and a lot of other factors. I mean, later on, of course, when we delved into the research, kind of an in-depth research of the specific histories of these objects, we came to recognize the multiplicity and the complexity of questions and kind of intellectual concepts that these artists were grappling with. And we also came to see that the very term abstraction or abstract art, in the way that we came to understand it, mostly through kind of scholarship of early 20th century European art, with figures like Kandinsky and Malevich and Mondrian and others, that understanding of abstraction was not always, exactly applicable to the objects that we had on our hands, or was only partially applicable to the works that we were looking at. So, while the project sort of set out to explore abstraction in North Africa and West Asia, what we arrived at was this perspective from which it became almost inevitable but to begin poking holes in this very term and this very paradigm of abstraction and abstract art, and begin questioning, how or whether or, to what degree does it really apply to some of the objects that we were looking at. And this is a challenge that I think translates to probably the study of any aspect of modernity in the non-West. So, when we kind of rely on a largely Eurocentric model of art historical scholarship, one that is predicated on a European Enlightenment, we also rely on the terms, the categories, the frameworks, the kind of methods of analysis that are inherent in that model. And, sometimes they're just not adequate for the understanding of particular phenomena that occurred in other places of the world, or maybe are only partially adequate for the study of such things. And in this regard, I think I can safely say that the exhibition has probably raised more questions than it was able to answer. But I do think it's a productive, not start to a conversation, because it's a conversation that's been going on, but hopefully a productive, node in the ongoing conversation and sort of an ongoing process of grappling with some of these questions. So just to give you an idea of, a couple of examples of what I mean when I say that abstraction and the way that we came to understand it through scholarship on modern European artists, that it doesn't always kind of translate in the exact same ways to the work of artists that we were looking at. These two images are from Sultan's essay in the exhibition catalog. On the left is Kuwaiti Jafar Islah with his quote-unquote abstract artwork, and on the right is a 19th century Anatolian kilim rug. And kilim rugs were sort of an area of fascination and research for Jafar for quite a while. And as we can see here, we're also, they also clearly inform some of the formal aspects of his early work. Another example from the exhibition is work by Kamal Bulata, which makes use of Arabic script, but also relies very much in its construction on mathematics and mathematical grids. And, of course, the idea of a grid is sort of, one of these major markers of modernity in art across different contexts. And in my introduction to the catalog, I quote Rosalind Krauss and her famous essay, Grids, where she says, I'm paraphrasing here, but the gist is that, she says the function or the purpose of the grid was to sort of assert the modernity of modern art. However, when we look at the trajectory of Kamal's career and also his personal life, we come to find that for him, the turn towards mathematics and grids was actually informed more by his early experiences of copying the geometric patterns and mosaics found on the facade of the Dome of the Rock, which of course, you know, have geometry and kind of, you know, mathematical principles at the basis of their construction. And also through Kamal's early experience of being trained under the icon painter Khalil Halabi, who trained him in the Byzantine tradition, which also, you know, relies very heavily on grids in the construction of these icons. So what I'm trying to get at here really is that while visually these works might be comparable, and in fact oftentimes are subject to comparison to other work under this larger umbrella of abstract art, and you know, sometimes rightly so, because there was kind of a fluency of exchange and travel and so forth, but oftentimes the kind of processes and historical references and connotations and even the political stakes of making these works were kind of located along different trajectories for these artists. And I think this calls for kind of an acknowledgement of, you know, certain specificities of these works and their contexts, or at least to, you know, a degree of specificity, and also invites, you know, a different reading and understanding, or at least the possibility of a different reading of seemingly familiar concepts. So, you know, one can begin to question, what does something as simple as a mathematical grid, you know, what can it mean if you look at it from a different perspective or in a different context? And, you know, of course, just in general, looking at these objects, we were struggling with these questions of, you know, you're kind of forced to formulate new, not just new questions, but new methods of looking at things and kind of new frameworks and new ways of formulating what it is that you're trying to understand. Just a final example here to illustrate the same point. This is a spread from the Maghreb Art magazine, published in the 1960s by the Casablanca School of Art. And it shows a student exercise where an Amazigh piece of jewelry was being studied, and its formal elements were being schematized into these black and white geometric compositions. And again, you know, it can become very tempting to kind of visually compare this to something like op art, for example, that developed in the 60s and even earlier. But this particular exercise actually took place under this rubric of decolonizing North African culture, and not just culture, but also their education models, where there was this turn towards local histories and, you know, looking at Amazigh, Islamic and pre-Islamic heritage, and just a general shift away from a French colonial vision of regional culture. So, you know, these questions of kind of categories and frameworks and terminology posed one set of methodological challenges for us as we were working through this project. But also, on the other hand, you know, the other set of challenges was kind of hinged more on the fact that, on the one hand, we were working with an expansive geographic area, which, as many of you know, is by no means homogeneous, while at the same time having a finite pool of works at our disposal, because we were working from a single private collection. And this is something that Sultan has alluded to as well in his presentation. So, you know, we were kind of faced with this question of, how do you attempt to reconcile these kind of seemingly two contradicting conditions? And then how does one even bring, you know, a sort of objective vision, let's say, to a collection that is already in many ways curated, right? Whether it's by the art market or by the collector's personal preferences, or, you know, perhaps even my own input into some of the acquisition decisions or the availability of works, and a million other factors that can be argued for. And then how do you kind of approach attempting to construct, if not a single coherent narrative, which, you know, would be living in dreamland, but at least identifying several historical threads that make sense and that, you know, may at times overlap or intersect or kind of happen in parallel, and be representative of at least some of the developments that took place in the region. And, you know, I have to say that some of these challenges, and I know this sounds probably incredibly cliche, but they actually did turn out to be kind of great opportunities, in the sense that, you know, because it's a single, you know, it's a private collection and a single lender, a sole lender, and a small team, and a sort of unconventional kind of internal setup within the team, we were able to move fast on a lot of these areas and kind of source and locate works through unconventional channels like social media that Sultan spoke about. So we were actually able to acquire a substantial number of works in the year leading up to the exhibition, which then allowed us to, you know, maybe patch up some of the historical gaps or strengthen some of the narratives that we wanted to foreground. So in many ways, you know, this actually kind of worked out in our favor. And, you know, in general, kind of looking at the exhibition, and especially looking back at the process of working on the exhibition, I kind of feel that even though it has a certain, you know, it kind of seems contained in the sense that, you know, we have the gallery show and we have the book, and they're both kind of packaged and ready to go in a way. But I do hope that despite this kind of appearance of completion of some sort, we can continue to look at this as an ongoing conversation and ongoing research. And, you know, when the exhibition does travel to its different venues, I kind of do hope that new questions and insights will continue to come up, and, you know, that we will be challenged in certain areas and maybe, you know, have to change our opinions on certain things. So I guess in short, I'm trying to say that I hope this kind of remains a living thing and an open-ended thing. I think I will leave it at this in the interest of time and pass the mic back to Lynn so we can have a discussion and maybe take some questions from the audience. Lynn?
Yes, thank you. Thank you both, Sultan and Suheyla, for really interesting observations. And it was fascinating to learn more about the history of Barjeel, because that's one thing we hadn't discussed. And then also, you know, some of the challenges Suheyla and I faced in trying to do an exhibition. And I really want to assert here that my participation was to bring fresh eyes to a collection, and it was really about a dialogue. So I was the non-expert in the room, coming and looking at these artworks, and then, you know, in the process discussing them with Suheyla, learning about them, and then making a selection, which is why I love my job. I'm always on this tremendous learning curve. And it's been such a pleasure to work with both of you and the Barjeel team. I want to mention also that the image you see behind me is, I'm virtually in the exhibition. We obviously had to shut down while the show was still on view. And we're hoping that once NYU reopens and it's safe to return to museums, that we'll be able to have the show on view for a little bit longer in New York. So keep posted on our website once we do reopen. For those of you who didn't get to see the show, hopefully this will allow you to come and see it. Finally, as Suheyla mentioned, we had lined up a really fantastic tour to go to 5 other university museums. And that is currently also in taking shape as we speak. Since all museums obviously have a backlog of exhibitions that were supposed to be presented right now, and that have been shifted and moving. So that's also in process, and we hope to keep you updated again via our website. My question for Suheyla first would be, I don't know if you remember, I don't, but we had a number of different titles that we were throwing around, and titling exhibitions is always one of the most challenging aspects. Do you remember any one of them, and how we, and I think it was you definitely came up with Taking Shape, which I think, implies that all these notions that we're exploring, as you mentioned, are still in formation. Do you remember any of the other ones? One was a line from an artist's manifesto, I think.
It was. I actually did end up using it as a title of my introductory essay. It was from a text by Mohammed Khadda, an Algerian artist, who wrote about how, with the advent of abstraction, there was no longer a horizon but infinity. So it kind of opened up the possibilities to artists to detach from a physical subject, and thereby kind of creating infinitely and in infinite directions. So I thought that was really poetic. So I did kind of keep it and use it for one of the essays in the exhibition catalog.
Thank you. And Sultan, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about the reaction within the Arab world, this vast geographic expanse that is anything but homogeneous. What have you heard, and what are, now that you've seen the show and that you've received the initial comments, what has struck you the most in terms of how people have received the exhibition?
I think, of course, most of the people I speak to are within my circle, so I assume they were too shy to tell me if there are any shortcomings, which I am sure there are so many shortcomings. And again, nothing to do with you guys, everything to do with me in this case, anything negative I meant. But I think on one hand, there was a great deal of encouragement and support, mainly because there had never been an exhibition on abstract Arab art before. There was an attempt by a group of people in Lebanon to put up an exhibition called Tajreed, which means abstraction, and they were so kind to share their catalog with us. That was never printed, but I have the PDF of it. And many of the works, believe it or not, are same artist, and in some cases they're the same works that ended up at the Gray only because I had acquired them along the way. And so what I have heard is a lot of support, but also maybe some of the criticism is that some countries were missing. Yes, we were missing Libya, we're missing Yemen, we're missing Saudi and Oman, and these are very important countries. And I think this reflects the shortcomings of this being based on the collection of an individual, in this case, myself. But in general, it was very supportive.
Great, thank you. I think I'm going to turn it over, and I'm going to bring up some of the questions that we've received. One from my colleague here at NYU, Pepe Carmel, is how do you see abstract artists fitting into the larger panorama of modern art from the Arab world? Suheyla, Sultan, any ideas?
Suheyla, go ahead.
Sure. Well, it's so funny in the US, when we had when we were speaking with some of the visitors to the exhibition that kind of asked us, was there no kind of figurative art in the Arab world? And in Sharjah, in the museum in our exhibition, because we had to take all of these works to New York, so it's mostly figurative works that are on display, visitors do ask us, well, was there no abstraction? Did artists not practice it? So I would say that there was definitely kind of activity in both areas. When it comes to abstraction, I think a lot of it was, kind of artists in the 1950s and 60s, you know, this was a moment of decolonization and kind of rising of pan-Arabism and Arab nationalism. So a lot of artists are beginning to look back at, you know, local histories and heritage. And a lot of it does actually happen to be non-objective and non-representational, such as Islamic patterns and Amazigh symbols. And, you know, the Arabic letter form, of course, was a medium, or let's say a motif that a lot of artists worked with. So I would say in that sense, definitely a lot of artists who practiced in, let's say, you know, the abstract mode, were looking back at these, you know, earlier histories. But then again, you know, I think this would take further research into things like how did, for example, Cold War politics influence, you know, the progression of, say, non-figurative and non-objective art versus more of like socialist realism. And so a lot of these distinctions were very much politically inspired as well. That's a great question and a very complicated one. I think it would take a lot more research to kind of contextualize it into a larger, you know, picture palette of what was happening.
Thanks, Suheyla. So we're getting a number of fascinating questions, and I apologize in advance that we won't be able to answer all of them, which is again another indication that Suheyla says this show is going to live on. We have the two other symposia sessions that are coming up, and then also just a real interest and hunger to learn more about some of these challenges that we all face. So I'm going to focus on some of the questions and group some of them, but one that's really, I think, very much to the point is, in our super connected and global world, does it make sense anymore to talk about quote unquote regional art?
Would you like me to answer that?
Sure, go ahead.
I definitely agree that there is a great case to be made for globalism, for international art, international movements and connections. But the reality is that 99.9% of all art history is written about Western art. And so it's very nice and, you know, good to say that we have to focus on internationalism when 0.0001% of the art is written about Africa, Middle East, and Asia. So yes, when there is a bit of more balance, then we can think about saying the world is global, we should focus on global art, but the scholarship is missing from Africa, from the Middle East, from Asia, even from Latin America. But I am definitely a proponent of looking at international art, but we need to invest. We need to invest on writing about Indian art and Pakistani art, Iranian art and Egyptian art, South African art and East Asian art. And so yes, definitely we are heading towards globalism and internationalism, but we need to focus on investing on scholarship and exhibiting art from underrepresented regions.
Fantastic. I think we've also had we had 2 or 3 questions about this notion of cultural diplomacy that Sultan spoke about. And I must say that there is a synergy between the Barjeel Art Foundation and the Gray Art Gallery, in that one of our principal collections is the Abby Weed Gray collection of modern and Middle Eastern art. And she was a very foresighted collector from the Midwest who started to collect contemporary art at the time in 1960 and traveled around the world 8 times to Iran, 4 times to Turkey, 4 times to India, which is why we have such strength in those areas. And she also organized a number of exhibitions. But do you want to talk about some of the pitfalls or some of the challenges in terms of cultural diplomacy?
I might use the example of the Iran exhibition, the exhibition that took place in Tehran. That was a very, very important exhibition in the history of Barjeel and the history of the region. It was written about in international newspapers, The Guardian, the Financial Times, local, regional media, Lebanese media, Persian media. That exhibition was very challenging to organize. And here I must thank our partners in Iran who really pulled through for us, and also former curators Mandi Merzaban and Karim Sultan, who traveled to Tehran when I wasn't able to. So I wasn't able to travel to Tehran because of the geopolitical dimension involved. And so, yes, there are many challenges. The fact that I couldn't go, the fact that the exhibition had to be organized almost in a under the radar way, that we couldn't publicize it until it opened. I had to, you know how I like to always post and tweet about everything. I wasn't able to post about it until it actually happened. So these are challenges that we face. I think in cultural diplomacy I don't claim to represent the UAE or the region, but I think that what we're trying to do is maybe help with deepening understanding. And I'll stop here.
All right, I'm gonna, again, I wish we could have time to address all these questions. So I'm gonna group two together. Doesn't modern art belong to artists beyond boundaries? Which I think we'd all agree to, yes. And that's very much what we're trying to do, is share the creativity of all these artists. And the question of whether or not there is a book for the show. And yes, the book was a very important part of the exhibition process. And we were very, yay, Suheyla has it up. We were very fortunate to collaborate with some of the leading experts, and another version. And it will be available on our website once, again, NYU reopens. And in the book is where we really try to go into depth and discuss the challenges of applying Western methodologies and the genesis, especially to Suheyla in her essay, the genesis of the term abstraction and the notion of art history, which of course was developed in Germany, the discipline of art history in Germany in the 19th century, and how we then apply it to non-Western art, and how we learn. So another question is, and Suheyla mentioned this, is will other works be added to the exhibition while it's on tour? And I can say definitively no. We would love to, but there are practical challenges involved with exhibitions such as building crates and, what is it, when you go through the douanier customs. So no, we can't, unfortunately, add other works. And I must say, one of the challenges, I mean, we love the fact that the show evolved while was still taking shape while we were in the process of putting it together. But it brought up also the notion that some of the works required conservation, and there were framing issues, all of which made for really interesting challenges, and where short time worked against us, a slight disadvantage. So I think I might have, well, here's an interesting questions. Both speakers mentioned Byzantine Greek connection. Have you thought of any cross-national, cross-religious exhibits, and anything in the works?
Suheyla.
Well, definitely. I would actually say even this exhibition is very much cross-national and cross-cultural and cross-religious. We do use the sort of title of Arab world, but of course, as we all know, it's not accurate neither demographically nor geographically. And in the exhibition, we actually do have works by artists of Armenian, Circassian, Turkish, Jewish, Kurdish, we don't have Kurdish, Amazigh. So we do have works from sort of different, of artists from different backgrounds. And, I think it's something we might have, briefly kind of mentioned. The region definitely was not in isolation. There was always this global exchange and a fluency of exchange, and artists did travel to study abroad and kind of had tutors that came to the region from abroad and exhibited and so on. So we're not trying to make a claim for sort of this isolationist artistic environment that existed within this space. And the only reason I bring up methodology and sort of ways of looking at particular objects is not to kind of criticize the methods themselves, but only to say that sometimes a different perspective or a different angle is needed in order to understand something for what it is. So, for example, yesterday, Sultan hosted a presentation by an Iraqi artist, and she was speaking about the work of Shakir Hassan al-Said, some of whose paintings we do have in the Taking Shape exhibition. And, she was saying how without understanding Sufism, you cannot really even begin to read the works of someone like Shakir. So this is what I mean when I speak about methodology. It's not to criticize any particular school of thought, or it's just to say that the application of the methods might not always, kind of work if you're really after understanding the object for what it was, for what it is and what it was created for.
All right, so thank you. I mean, I wish we could go on for longer, and I'm going to perhaps suggest that we expand our future sessions to an hour and a half to keep these kind of discussions going. One last question was about, the frustration of not being able to see the show in person, and how we chose the historical period of the 1950s to the 1980s, and I'll answer that quickly. Again, it was based on the collection. I would have liked to have gone back further into the early 20th century, but the works in the collection, they really start in the 1950s. There's some in the 40s and one or two, I think, from the 1930s, but it made sense. And then we didn't want to make it a contemporary show. We were looking back some 3 decades, and so we ended up with the 80s as a good ending point. As it turns out, this was a very tumultuous and fascinating time in the region, and so that allowed us to explore various artists and how they responded. I mean, one particularly interesting thing for me that was about parallels with African-American artists during the civil rights movement, when a number of artists, African-American artists who were working in abstraction, were criticized for not doing figurative works that would advance the cause. And in this period of decolonialization, I think there were similar issues and that were discussed in the countries themselves, and we'll broach those in some of the other future talks. For those of you who can't see the exhibition or won't be able to even when we reopen, I do want to let you know that we have all the works up on our website with all the didactic labels. And we also have a wonderful virtual tour by one of our graduate interns, Saga Beyuz, who takes you through the exhibition with very selected highlights. And we also have other discussions and other blogs and a wealth of information and responses, again, all on our website. So I want to thank Sultan and Suheyla. Great to see you, even if it's across continents and via Zoom. And turn the mic back to Lucy, who will provide some concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sultan, Suheyla, Lynn, many thanks for this fascinating discussion. And thanks to everyone in the audience for all your questions and for tuning in. Please note that Pepe Carmel, who asked one of those questions that Lynn mentioned, will be the moderator of our next session, which will take place a week from today at 6 p.m. You can see the details on this concluding screen. So please tune in to our future sessions. There will be 2 of them. And finally, a reminder that this program is being recorded and will be made available on our website with closed captions in the future. So this is Lucy Oakley signing off. Stay safe and be well, everyone.